We have a 37-minute film that goes along with today's speech, so we're very short on time, as we know you all want to go to classes eventually. So I'll just say that the person we're having speak and lecture you today, who also took the movies that we're going to be seeing, is very well equipped to explain the situation in South Vietnam. So now I'd like to introduce Mr. Kenneth Armstrong.
Mr. Boxer, I'm very pleased to be here at UCLA. I would have been more pleased if the events of Saturday night had turned out a little differently, since I went to the University of Michigan. I hoped I could come and gloat, but instead I have to come and offer congratulations. The film that you're going to see is film that was taken last April and May when I was over in Vietnam. It was my third trip there. I'd been there previously in 1961, 1962, and just about a year ago at this time I spent some 8 months over in Southeast Asia, primarily Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand. One of the questions that people quite frequently ask me, I'm sure that most of you with a better awareness of history than most Americans, it's not a problem in your own minds, but people often say, where in the world do these countries come from, like Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam? We never heard of them before. Where did they spring from? A lot of people don't realize that old French Indochina was divided up into 1954 to independent nations, nations which had existed prior to the time that the French took them over in 1893. And as many of you know, in the July conference in 1954 at Geneva, the Geneva Conference agreed that there would be North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The North Vietnamese, I'm sure at that time, thought that the South would easily be theirs eventually. One of the reasons why the communists agreed to this partition of Vietnam. The North Vietnamese coveted the South for several reasons. They have the typical appetite of a communist power for spreading out. But at the same time, the South complements the North. The North is primarily industrial and is chronically short of rice. The South is agricultural, a surplus crop of rice, and a very productive crop of rubber. However, the North Vietnamese did not realize that President Diem would step forward and restore order out of chaos, that he would create a viable country. But when they did realize that things were moving along progressively in South Vietnam, they decided to do by force what they were unable to do through patience. And starting in 1959 particularly, men and material were infiltrated from North Vietnam into South Vietnam to stir up the dissidents in South Vietnam against the government. They were so successful that President Diem turned to the United States and asked us for help. And we responded, as you know, and are continuing to respond. The question often arises as to why we are there. Well, they aren't purely altruistic, as you might realize. The United States ideologically has said that it's a test as to whether a country can forcibly take over a neighbor. But quite basically, most wars are economic, and this is no different than most wars. The North wants the rice and rubber of the South. Red China wants what comes after South Vietnam. South Vietnam would be able to outflank Cambodia. Cambodia would fall easily, and then the prizes coveted by the Red Chinese are next door, Thailand and Malaysia. From this area comes 90% of the world's natural rubber, 50% of the world's tin, and a surplus crop of rice. I must say quite cynically, if the United States could be convinced somehow, some way, that the Red Chinese appetite and the appetite of the North Vietnamese would be satisfied by the conquest of South Vietnam, we'd probably pull out. But it's the fear that they will not be satisfied. That the imperialism which moved south in World War II for the reasons of rice, rubber, and oil is being supplanted by another imperialism which wants the same thing. Well, then that leads to the question, how are we doing? There are three opinions in Vietnam today. One is we're tied, another is we're losing, and a third is we've lost. Those are the three optimistic pronouncements. I didn't find many people who believed we were tied. Most everybody agreed we were either losing or we had lost. But to understand the situation as it exists over there, the terrain, the identification problem, I think you have to see the film with your own eyes to better understand this basic problem that we have in Vietnam. So if we may, we'll have the lights out and let's take a quick trip to Vietnam and see for ourselves what the country's like and how things are going. South Vietnam is about 40% the size of California. You can see here how it's on the balcony of Southeast Asia. North Vietnam is about the same size, 14 million people in South Vietnam, approximately 15 million in North Vietnam. Next door, Cambodia, Laos, then you can see Thailand and Malaysia, how they come down. It's a long, narrow country, and those pink areas are those sections controlled by the communists effectively. In most instances, the government controls the land by day, the Viet Cong control it by night. The capital city, Saigon, is a city of some 2 million people, and you can stand on top of your hotel at night and watch firing out in the rice plains in the distance. Tall buildings, reminiscent of some of your buildings of Europe. In fact, the French used to call this area the Paris of the Orient, but the aroma I noticed was not necessarily that of Chanel No. 5. It was something more basic. The Saigon River winds some 50 miles up the South China Sea, and it's the reason why Saigon is a world port. One of the main products loaded, of course, is rubber, which provides about 75% of Vietnam's foreign exchange. Much of the South is laced with canals, people moving about to conduct commerce, old tires to be cut up into sandals, and coconut on the half shell. Over there, they have no drive-ins. The drive-ins come to you. They're walk-ins, I guess you could call them. And here's a lovely Saigonese housewife, after a busy day shopping, getting ready to board her taxi cab to go home with her purchases. The thing that gets you about Saigon or any area when you're a visitor is the emotional exhaustion that you experience. You never know when that toy gun may turn out to be a real gun. You never know as you walk down the street, very prominent because of the color of your skin, whether that man coming towards you on a bicycle, in a pedicab, in a taxi, or on foot may not suddenly pick a grenade out of his pocket and roll it at your feet. It happens. Most of the people who live in Saigon endure such conditions as this: little houses along fetid canals, eking out an existence that's barely above subsistence. And the contrast between how the people live and how the French lived is quite dramatic. The French often believed they were never going to leave, so there was no point in preparing the people for a day that would never come. The sidewalk cafes have pulled their tables inside to protect the customers against terrorists. It was rather disconcerting to find a hand grenade instead of an olive in your martini, so they pulled all the tables inside. As you walk down the street, window shopping, if you see a group of Americans standing on the sidewalk, you almost involuntarily circle wide around them because more than 2 Americans stationary are an inviting target for the Viet Cong. The Caravel Hotel in the background and the National Assembly, which doesn't meet anymore. People at the Caravel were shocked a couple of months back to find the 5th floor in the middle of the street there. Communist bomb had sort of displaced it. Every once in a while, though, there is a little oasis of peace. For example, the flower market, another vestige of French days. And among the flowers that are most popular over there are the lilies, which seems appropriate in this day and age. But again, I can't emphasize too much the terrorism that stalks you. It's ever present. You never know when somebody's going to take a pot shot at you or try to eliminate you. Even the American embassy is not immune. They've tried to blow it up a couple of times. They have barricades on the outside to keep unwanted visitors away and a guard on duty 24 hours a day. There are still signs of the coup d'etat which threw out President Diem and his brother and sister-in-law and the rest of the family in November of 1963. The Presidential Guard barracks were nearly leveled in that attack, and the president and his brother were living in Geelong Palace at the time, and it was from here that they fled only to be captured and murdered later. Today it's the residence of whomever happens to be premier at any given moment. There are rumors that there is a moving van permanently parked behind the palace. The costume worn by the ladies is called the ao dai, It accentuates the positive and eliminates the negative, and if you're a leg man, don't bother going over to Saigon because you never see them. About 10% of the population are Roman Catholic, as you know. The Buddhists claim anybody who isn't a Roman Catholic. Their main pagoda is Za Loi. And it's interesting that Za Loi, as the head of a major faction of the Buddhists, the leadership of this particular pagoda have not been in the forefront of some of the demonstrations against the government in recent months. But I think it's misunderstood what President Zim's relationship was to the Buddhists in the closing days. There's no question about it, that there was persecution of the Buddhists. But prior to that time, what the Buddhists resented so very, very much was the favoritism given to Catholics. And the Catholics were favored by Zim, not only because he was a Catholic, but because they had a better school system and better products from that school system, and most of them were dedicated anti-communists. He felt he could rely better on the Catholics, and he favored them and their villages. Now the Buddhists want this just to be turned around. We're going to fly up to Tai Ninh. Look at the plane we're going to go on, Maybe. I hate to fly in a plane called Maybe. I like to go on one called Sure Thing or Round Trip or something like that. As you fly towards Tai Ninh, about 75 miles from Saigon near the Cambodian border, you can pass these rubber plantations still operated by the French or sometimes Italians and Swiss. The French still are very prominent in the economic scene in South Vietnam today. In contrast, America has very few investments over there. There are deep, tangled jungles en route. It's a place where the Viet Cong often skulk to come out at night to conduct their forays. And the reason we've come up to Tai Ninh is to see another very prominent embodiment of religion in Vietnam, the Cao Daists. And this is their temple in Tai Ninh. The Cao Daists are the third largest sect in Vietnam. The Buddhists first, the Catholics, and then the Cao Daists about the same size, over 1 million. Most of the people, however, are ancestor worshippers, Confucius believers. But as I said, the Buddhists like to claim anybody that isn't Catholic. There are relatively few Protestants. But the Cao Daists are interesting. Here are their leaders. Sun Yat-sen, the Chinese revolutionary, is considered a saint of the church, as is Victor Hugo, who's superintendent of missionaries, whatever that is. And Tran Trung, a Vietnamese mystic. God and humanity, love and justice are the major precepts of Cao Daism. And Cao Daism is a blend of the major religions of the world. It was founded in the 1920s. They have a heavenly chorus up in the balcony, which doesn't sound so heavenly. But they've taken blendings of various religions. They've taken sections from Catholicism or Christianity, from Buddhism, from Hinduism, from Mohammedanism, from Taoism, from Confucius, put it into one big religion. They believe that they have the third alliance between God and man. First was Moses and God, the second was Jesus and God, and the third is between the Cao Daists and God. And they hold masses like the Catholics do. They have a hierarchy like the Catholics do. They have popes and cardinals. And the garments of the leadership look like they borrowed that from the Ku Klux Klan. But they hold masses usually twice a month in their Vatican, their Holy See of Cao Daism, and the symbol of the church is the all-seeing eye. They get their inspiration through seances. They're a very ascetic group. They burn incense and give offerings like the Buddhists do. For some reason, the men wear halos and the women don't. I don't know that this is a social commentary on the part of the Cao Daists or not. But in the old days, President Zim really gave these people the business. Many of them fled into exile in Cambodia. And he regarded them as the worst kind of heretics. Now today, many of them have come back from exile and are cooperating with the government in the fight against the Viet Cong. In the Tai Ninh area, we're not too far from Cambodia. You find that one of the important crops is cassava or manioc. The Vietnamese are primarily rice eaters, as are most people of Asia, but they do grow cassava. It's a root. They have to scrape it, then they grind it up and leach out the prussic acid. They make flour, and then from this they either make pastry or they feed it to the pigs. And here's the shaking table. It comes off, and then when those baskets gets full, this chap dumps it and adds his own unique flavor to the cassava. After I saw this, I didn't want to eat any rolls over there. The Vietnamese, it's essentially an agrarian society with craftsmen. artisans. They make excellent furniture, for example, and some of the finest furniture is made in the Tay Ninh area. Another reason I'd come to Tay Ninh was to see the Chu Hoi Center at Tay Ninh. And I want you to look at these people and tell me what they have in common, whether it's their clothing, looks on their faces, their haircuts. What is it that these people have in common? I'll answer the question for you. They're all ex-communists, wearing the clothing that they were wearing when they came in and surrendered to the government. Chu Hoi means open arms or defector center. And these people, after having served the Viet Cong, come in and are re-indoctrinated into the government program. Eventually they'll be released to start life anew in some city other than their original village, so that Viet Cong agents can't assassinate them for their cooperation with the government. But it's funny to look at these faces and realize that only a few days before, many of these people have been bearing arms against the government. And you can see by the clothing and by the faces how difficult it is to isolate the Viet Cong from the people. Who is a Viet Cong? Who isn't? How do you tell the good guys from the bad guys? This is probably the major and overriding problem in Vietnam today, because the Viet Cong eschew uniforms, usually dress and melt in with the peasantry in a typical guerrilla war, or as the communists like to call it, a national war of liberation. The Viet Cong is an abbreviation for Vietnamese communist, while the name Vietnam itself means South Viet. It's a Chinese word to distinguish the Viets who moved into Vietnam, what we call Vietnam today, from those who remained behind in China. Flying back to Saigon in a little helio, we saw another favorite trick of the communists, to furrow the roads. This road had just been finished by the U.S. aid program. The communists came in that night and forced the peasants to go out and trencher it. The government came back the next morning and forced them to fill it in. The communists came back that night and forced them to dig it up. The government came back the next morning and forced them to fill it in, and on this went. And this illustrates another problem in Vietnam. The fact that the peasantry in many instances have to temporize. They have to play it neutral, because they can never guarantee on government protection. They have to play both sides. We're going to fly in a helicopter south to Mo Kai. To go by road is either very brave or very stupid. I'm not very brave, and I don't think I'm stupid, so whenever possible I would go by air. Most of our casualties have occurred in ambushes on the roads of South Vietnam. There aren't many of them, and they're easily interdicted by the Reds. Even by air is no guarantee you're going to fly now and live longer. An Army Caribou transport, just like the one we flew in up to Tay Ninh, had been shot down only 20 miles from Saigon, 12 Americans killed. Those machine guns are not for decoration, they are used constantly. The great wealth of Vietnam comes from the Mekong River. The mother of everything is how it translates, flowing some 2,800 miles from Tibet through China, picking up soil and dumping that soil in the rich delta region of Vietnam. Along with us on this trip was the province chief of Kinh Hoa province, and we're going down to see one of his cities. Down below, some of the coconut plantations, another favorite hiding place for the Viet Cong, who usually sleep in plantations such as this during the day, coming out at night to conduct their raids against government-held territory. Kinh Hoa is one of the worst provinces in Vietnam. 40 miles south of Saigon, we had to be guarded by gunships, HU-1B helicopters. The military people call them Hueys, who circled around us like angry little hornets, pouring suppressing fire on those who were shooting at us from down below. The children greeted us rather warmly, too warmly. I was wearing shorts on this particular occasion, and they've never seen hair on the legs of people, and unfortunately I'm richly endowed, and everybody wanted a souvenir. And before I got through, those little rascals had practically plucked me bare. So after that, I always wore long pants. But Colonel Chow was down to see the defenses of Mo Kai. He only controlled about 30% of the province and about 200,000 of the 500,000 people in the province. The rest were controlled by the communists. And the communists had attacked Mo Kai a few nights before, had broken through the barbed wire, and nearly swept into the town. The second line of defense were these foot spikes, a device used by the communists, now copied by the government forces. As you might imagine, when you step on one of those, you don't run very far, very fast. Colonel Chow was well guarded because the communists had made as their target government officials. In the last 7 years, they've assassinated approximately 15,000 government officials, province chiefs, district chiefs, police chiefs, mayors, school teachers, health officers. City Hall is well guarded. Every once in a while, the Reds toss in mortar shells to let everybody inside know that they are thinking of them. If attacked, they light up this arrow at night to point to the direction of the attackers, so planes overhead know where they are. And that Jeep had hit a mine. That's why you don't go by road. But there's a little more confidence in Mo Kai today as a result of the government victory over the communists in this area. Goods were now on sale. You could buy watermelon, you could buy pineapples, and you could buy a Vietnamese lollipop, a stick of sugar cane. They don't have candy as we know it. And they also grind up the sugar cane to make a juice, which they drink in lieu of cola drinks, things that we know of. Here's Speedy Delivery Service eagerly pumping away to make his deliveries. In this area, people don't move very fast. They have two types of weather, hot and humid and hotter and humid. It's always warm. You just can't get away from it. Eternal heat. The Delta area is quite unique, too, in the fact that virtually all traffic takes place on canals. It's very low, very swampy. In fact, there was one big swamp that was converted into rice paddies. When you travel, you go by boat. The canals are not only used as swimming pools and highways and pathways, but they're also used as a place to wash your clothes, as a place to take a bath, and as a place to go to the bathroom, and once in a while as a place to get your drinking water. Disease is endemic, many kinds of it in this area. The product they're unloading has been brought from Saigon. They're dependent on these boats coming in from the outside because the communists have control of the road around the town. And the product you just saw there in the jugs is called Nuc Mam. It's fermented fish sauce, which the Vietnamese dote on. It really isn't too bad if you don't faint before you get it into your mouth. But there, instead of taking the family for a ride on the freeway, you get out the old family sampan and take Mama for a poling down one of the canals in this area. The troops are on guard because the communists are just on the other side of the canal. They're there to pour out the fire in the event the helicopter is shot at. The gunships perpetually hovering overhead, acting as cover for us as we take off, the boys leaning out the door with their machine guns ready to fire. And we did fire when we came in and when we went out because we were fired at. In fact, if you aren't fired at when you go out in one of these troops, you wonder if the Viet Cong no longer care. This is just one of the facts of life that you have to endure over there. This is all Viet Cong held territory, and it was funny as you went over this area to realize that they have their own tax collectors, they have their own schools, their own hospitals, their own post offices, their own recruiting grounds, their own training centers, a completely parallel form of government to that of Saigon and usually more efficient. Most of the people are engaged in rice, as I indicated a little earlier. This is the great prize of Vietnam, the surplus crop of rice. But now I've shown you a government town, now I want to show you a Viet Cong town. This is the first time the government flag has been flying in over 2 years. This is a communist monument with communist propaganda, probably made with stolen American cement. Here's a hole where the Viet Cong had planted a bomb with one of their propaganda signs on the outside, ready to go off if you had unwaringly pulled at it. Their propaganda slogans had been splashed all over the walls. And the people were sullen. They were hostile. They were most unfriendly. Their friends, their relatives, had been in the Viet Cong forces, which had been pushed aside by government forces into the swamps. It's true that the government can practically take any territory at once. The problem is, how long is it willing to stay there in strength to hold it? This was true of this area around Gokong. As the Reds retreated, they blew up the bridges and merely melted away into the swamps, waiting for the government to grow tired of staying here in strength, pull out, and then they will re-infiltrate into this area. A little fishing village, and it was hard again to look upon the faces of these men as they unloaded fish, as they mended nets, or as they wove rope, to realize that these are people who lived under communism for 2 years. And I asked some of them, how was life under the communists? And one of them surprised me by answering, not bad. And I asked him to explain himself. And he says, well, we had a bad land problem here with absentee landlords. This is not true everywhere in Vietnam, but it was in this area. And when the Viet Cong came in, they arbitrarily divided up all the land and gave it to us free of charge. So this made them relatively popular. I says, but eventually you'll be thrown into a collective farm as they have been in North Vietnam. And he says, oh, our Viet Cong tell us that they are different from the communists in North Vietnam. He said, you aren't too popular here either because Vietnamese planes bombed our town. And I could see that only the pillars of some houses still remain. This is a very controversial issue in Vietnam. Government planes had drawn fire from this town, so they retaliated by bombing it. But tragically, women and children were killed in the bombing of this town. And there are many Americans over there who feel that towns such as this, unless they can be firmly identified as purely a Viet Cong training center, should not be hit from the air, that you usually win more enemies than friends as a result. When the Army leaves, the responsibility for guarding the villages in this particular area will be turned over to the Self-Defense Corps, the village militia, called the SDC, Self-Defense Corps. The government's major problem, as I said, is it has to defend everything and the communists nothing. The communists strike when they want to at targets of their own choosing. The government rarely knows where they're going to strike. It's almost impossible for government forces to defend every village, every bridge. And so they train these self-defense corps to serve as village militia. They're ill-trained usually, they're ill-shod, they're ill-equipped, and they're ill-paid. Their motivation, to say the least, is not very high. In many instances, they would rather run than fight. Sometimes they'd rather switch than fight. But in many ways, you can't blame them, because they have not been properly prepared, properly motivated for the role that they're supposed to fill. The Viet Cong forces number about 40,000 hardcore. Approximately 30% of them are North Vietnamese. The leadership, the backbone, the officers, the commissars. The remainder, the 70%, are generally South Vietnamese, either persuaded to join the Viet Cong or forcibly recruited. The government forces number about 400,000. And a good part of those 400,000 are village defense corps, as we just saw. Going deeper into the heart of the Delta, we're going to go to the village of Long Phu. This is about 120 miles from Saigon. The only way we could identify it was by the smoke grenade. All the villages along these canals which stretch to the horizon look the same. You really can't identify one from another. Long Phu was rather interesting. Not only did it have to be supplied by air, because down in this area the communists again controlled the entrances and exits into Long Phu. Here's the Wilshire Boulevard of Long Phu, and there's one of their local nightclubs, and people supplementing their diet. But what was interesting about Long Phu was the man who was the spiritual and lay leader of the village, Father Tong, a Roman Catholic priest. Just so nobody gets a wrong idea as to my own personal prejudices, I happen to be a Presbyterian. But he's one of the most remarkable men I'd ever met. He came from North Vietnam approximately 10 years ago, fled the communists, and set up life anew in this area. He'd been so successful with the people in this area that the communists were determined that he had to go. So one night they attacked in force, 1,200 of them. Father Tong and his defenders were forced to retreat into the parish house, fought for their lives. They sent out a call for American planes, which came over, dropped flares, and strafed the attacking Reds again and again until they were forced to retreat with 200 dead. Long Phu was saved. But one of the things that's hard for Americans to understand is this. These are mines that were carried on the backs of Viet Cong kamikazes, who, when they reached the barbed wire, somebody behind them pulled a string and blew them up and blew up the barbed wire. How do you explain such fanaticism that they're willing to sacrifice their lives merely to sever a few strands of rusty barbed wire? These are Viet Cong that were captured in that attack. The fanaticism is one of the great problems with which one has to cope in Vietnam. And I think the basic answer is the fact that most of them believe that they're fighting for instant paradise. That if and when they win, all good things will come to them. Villas, cars, high prices for their rice, plenty of medical care, plenty of education. These are the things that they want. Father Tong and his defenders are doing their best to remain alive in this area. And I said to Father Tong, why is it that they have picked on you particularly? Why are they so determined that you have to be wiped out? And he said, quite simple. My support has grown from 1 to 10,000 in this area, and half are Buddhists. I love them all, Catholics or Buddhists, and my people know this. I'm having more success with my doctrine than they are with theirs, and they don't like the competition. So I have to be removed. I said, are you going to hold out? He said, it's not a question whether we will, we must. As we flew out of this area, little did I know that about 2 months ago, Long Fu would again be attacked by the communists. And again, Father Tong and his defenders drove them back. He's quite a guy, quite a remarkable guy. His eyes just exuded love and kindness. And he was one of the most dedicated, humane, and pragmatic leaders that I met in South Vietnam. We're down in Camau, a provincial capital, 150 miles south of Saigon, very close to the end of South Vietnam. This area has been controlled south of here by the communists ever since 1941. It's sparsely populated, swamps, spotty little villages, training ground for them. And American helicopters, 20 of them, American crews aboard, are there to pick up 10 soldiers each and to take them to attack a communist headquarters 20 miles south of Camau. They're flying H-21 helicopters, and I can't say enough for the crews that are flying these planes. They are among the most dedicated, brave men I've ever met. Flying helicopters that are obsolete to start with, they're overloaded, they're under-maintenanced, and overflown. But other than the usual griping, they carried out their tasks with singular devotion. The helicopter has been a unique introduction into South Vietnam in that it enables you to go over the ambushes instead of through them, to bring mobility to this guerrilla war. And unfortunately, I hadn't asked how we were going to fly, and suddenly I found that we were zipping along at about 100 miles an hour. The noise is deafening as the water hits off the rice paddies in contour flying. So low I could practically pluck the rice as we went by. Every once in a while you would hear a blap from one of these little huts. Somebody was firing at you. Every time I heard blap, my breakfast went up and down like a yo-yo. 9 times up and fortunately 9 times down. And you wondered, isn't this ride ever going to end? I've never been so frightened in all my life. And suddenly we arrived at the landing zone, shuddering right over the rice paddy. The troops jumped out and water up to their knees. Bullets are cracking and snapping all around us. They're moving to the tree line where the Reds are entrenched. And you wonder, aren't we ever going to get out of here? This is when you're most vulnerable. Finally, we did get out, but only 19 helicopters flew back to Camau out of the 20 that started. When you're hovering, you're a relatively stationary target, and this is when the Viet Cong usually get you, particularly if they know you're coming, which they frequently do. Everybody could breathe a sigh of relief as we came back into Camau. The first of 4 operations on this day were over. We had 4 more days of this to go on. Immediately we wanted to know, anybody hurt? This gunner had a close call, some fragment wounds over his eyes from a Viet Cong bullet. The crew of the helicopter shot down had been picked up safely. They were back at Camau relaxing with a cigarette. And then one of the gunships, one of the Hueys, came back with a souvenir, a Viet Cong soldier. I want you to take a good look at him. He's wearing a Viet Cong uniform, which is a peasant's costume. He wears no armband, no uniform, no hammer and sickle on his forehead. The only way you can identify a Viet Cong is if he picks up a gun, aims it at you, and fires. Then you got a strong hunch he's a Viet Cong. This is why it's such a nasty war. The problem of identifying the enemy, who he is, until he commits a hostile act. Writer Dick Dragaskis holds a hand grenade that they found strapped to the leg of this guy. Fortunately, he'd been so well tied up he was unable to pull the pin. He was dedicated, he was hardcore. We leave the Delta to go to the north, near Quy Nhon. And this area to me is most interesting because it's right through here that the communists have severed Vietnam. In a concerted drive, in strength, they have gone right to the sea. But when I was there last June, the people were, in a tremendous outburst of labor, were building this ditch 30 miles long by hand Over 12 million man-hours were going into this ditch, using hose and little baskets for one reason and one reason only. People often talk about the will of the Vietnamese people to fight, whether they support the government. Most of them still do. In this area, these people were so determined to keep the communists out of their area that they built this wall and ditch, 30 miles long, from a river to the sea. Strung it with barbed wire and bamboo stakes on the side. They were tired of turning over their sons to the Viet Cong, of surrendering information, of surrendering food. Tired of harassment by the Viet Cong. They decided that extreme measures were needed. And so they gathered together and constructed this wall, a throwback to the Middle Ages, to defend their villages. To get into the village during the day, they open up this gap, and you come across this narrow pole. By the way, this is the only time I saw female legs all the time I was over there. And I was pleased to see that they weren't bad. Up to that point, it had been hearsay as to whether they were or not. The communists are in the hills out beyond. And just outside of the wall, you could see the peasants with their plow over their shoulder, the water buffalo behind. Water buffaloes don't like Americans, and they tell us it's because we have the offensive aroma of soap on our bodies, an aroma with which they're not familiar. And you can see how this next water buffalo really veers away from us. It's a water buffalo society. 90 to 95% of the people are engaged in the year-round struggle to try and harvest enough food out of relatively little land to sustain their families. A Vietnamese housewife will spend much of her day weeding rice, such as this woman is doing. A land where the average income is $70 a year. The life expectancy 35 to 40 years. Where 50% of the children die before they reach the age of 5. Where only 1 out of every 4 people can read or write. It's a most difficult life. It's a life where people keep hoping that life suddenly will become gentler and will treat them with greater kindness. And quite frequently, communist propaganda finds willing subjects because of their frustration with the life that they must lead. We're now up in the high plateau, our last stop on this journey. High plateau forms about 2/3 of Vietnam. Up here live about 1 million people out of the 14 million, and they're a most unique people, quite dissimilar from the Vietnamese. They're known as the Montagnard, or the hill people. The Montagnard are very superstitious. They have signs on top of their rice houses to ward away the evil spirits. Malayo-Polynesian by extraction. They grow pineapples and bananas. They're quite different from the Vietnamese, who originally came from China about 3,000 years ago and who drove the Montagnard into the wrinkled mountains and into the dense jungles. And ever since then, the Vietnamese has been the traditional enemy of the Montagnard. The Montagnard are people still living virtually in the Stone Age, people persecuted, despised by the Vietnamese, who call them Moi, which means savage, and they treat them as such. They detest the Vietnamese in turn, and many of them cooperate with the Viet Cong as the lesser of two evils, but they don't like the Viet Cong usually because they generally are Vietnamese also. Suddenly a third force entered this picture, an alternative to them, American Special Forces, U.S. Army Special Forces, and offered these men a choice between the Vietnamese north or south. And our missionaries to the Montagnard are the U.S. Army medics, who probably have won more friends and influenced more people than any other individuals in Vietnam today, and particularly in the high plateau area with the Montagnard. These are people who are bugged by life, whose life alternates between work and pain, where disease is rampant, living in little houses where the children start to smoke as soon as they can hold one, The woman can be identified as a married woman by the bracelet on her arm, also by the children that she has regularly. They have drums to drive away the evil spirits, which they believe surround them on every side. And here is our alert, handsome, and gregarious host, who welcomed us to his hut, which is a long house, different rooms for sleeping, for eating, for the various members of the family. The Montagnards believe that spirits intending to do them harm live in the bushes, in the trees, in the clouds, in the sky, everywhere. Extremely superstitious, frightened of strangers. Some of them only bathe once a year for fear that they will offend the spirit that resides in the water nearby, in the stream. And I must have been up here the day before they were to take their annual bath. Their costume can best be described as cool. They don't have much of a laundry problem. In the high plateau, even though they make up better than 95% of the population, they do not have one government official to represent them. They're all Vietnamese. And that's why many of them have joined the Viet Cong out of pure frustration at the government's failure to give them better representation and better recognition. All their graves are above ground. It's a slingshot society, a crossbow society. Poverty-stricken people who don't know which way to turn. But because the medics have showed up and have proven to their satisfaction that somebody does care, the first people to treat them with kindness and with humanity, many of them have come over in droves to the Americans, not to the Vietnamese. And they're vital because those are the hills of Laos in the background. It's through this area that the Ho Chi Minh Corridor winds, with exit points off in this area. It's through this area that the North Vietnamese are infiltrating from North Vietnam into the South. Because of the success of the American program, the communists are burning their villages. Illustrative of another communist tactic, selective terror. Assassination, burning villages, to cow the people into, if not support of the Viet Cong, at least non-support of the government. Indicative that the government can't protect them, to destroy confidence in the government. As a result of the Special Forces medics who have gone out, won friends and influenced people, many of the Montagnards have come in to be trained. These are commandos. I call them the 3 Bs, the bearer behind a brigade, in full uniform, who will be trained to go out and ambush the Reds for a change, instead of letting the Reds do the ambushing. This has been one of the most successful programs in Vietnam until recent months. The Vietnamese demanded control. It was given to them about 3 or 4 months ago. The Montagnards revolted and killed more than 40 of their Vietnamese officers, so command has been given back to the American Special Forces units. These thatch will be used to build additional barracks for the recruits that are coming in, recruits who've been won over by the U.S. medics. It's quite a sight to see these people who've never handled anything more complicated than a crossbow suddenly given a rifle grenade and taught how to use it. They're extremely loyal. They've been diligent fighters. They don't like Vietnamese north or south, but so far they've liked the Americans. And it's one of the ironies that someday, if the situation ever does stabilize in Vietnam, the reason may be because of these people who are detested by the very people that they're attempting to help. Just a few final comments before we quit, and those of you, I know some of you have to go to classes, others of you I'll be happy to stay and answer questions. As you may have gathered, I find myself in a quandary over the Vietnamese situation. Most of the Americans who are over there feel that it is necessary for us to stay, that if the communists aren't stopped here, they'll have to be stopped in Thailand. We merely will shift the scene of action from one place to another. And yet, at the same time, there are many of us who have been over there are distressed by the fact that for too many years the emphasis was on raising the military standard of the Army instead of raising the living standard of the people. That not enough time was spent on motivating the people to support the government. And it's an oversight which we're paying for today. I don't know whether Vietnam can be saved or not. Eventually there will be negotiations, but unfortunately the only thing the North Vietnamese want to negotiate is American forces out, without indicating that they're willing to pull their forces out. And if they don't pull their forces out, and we should, Vietnam would go under in about 6 weeks. I asked an American what the first thing was he was going to do when he got home, and he said, the first thing I'm going to do when I get home is I'm going to kiss my wife and my kids, sit them down on the couch, and I'm going to tell them all about Vietnam. I'm going to tell them what I went through. I'm going to tell them what the Vietnamese people are going through. And if they don't cry, I'm going to beat the hell out of them. There are many of us who have been over there who have an emotional attachment to the people of Vietnam. We have an emotional attachment to those people who have been willing to stand up on the side of the government to fight the communists. Many of us fear that if America should pull out, it would be done away with by the new regime. Millions of people whose only sin was they tried to help their country and tried to help the Americans who were trying to help their country. This is a Viet Cong flag. It was taken off one of the Viet Cong dead at the village of Long Phu. One of the tragedies of Vietnam, too, is the fact that there aren't more Father Tongs. A man who radiates humanity, kindness, charity, love to the people in his area, who strives every day to better their life. But because there aren't many Father Tongs, unfortunately today, there are many of these flags. Thank you very much, and if I can answer questions, I'll certainly be delighted to do so. For those of you who don't have to go to class, I'll be happy to answer questions. Yes? The question is, if it's obvious that the field of battle will eventually be transferred to one of the nearby countries, what are these countries doing to prepare themselves against this eventuality? In Thailand particularly, there are great efforts going on in civic action in trying to upgrade the living standards of the people in the areas which would be most affected, particularly the northeast section of Thailand. The government of Thailand has been in a crash program for approximately the last 4 or 5 years to build roads, to build wells, to bring in better rice, to bring in fertilizer, trying to destroy the conditions that have led to legitimate grievances on the part of these people, and which can be used by the communists to win many of them over to an anti-government program. Thailand particularly is working towards the eventuality that both Laos and Vietnam will fall. Laos will go in nothing flat. The Laos basically are lovers, not fighters. And the North Vietnamese, if they come in there, the Laos will practically cover the Mekong River in their hurry to get across to Thailand. They're delightful, lovable people. I like them very much, but they just don't fight. Cambodia is trying to prepare for the eventuality by cozying up to Red China. Prince Sihanouk, the leader of Cambodia, feels that the battle is all but lost in Vietnam, and so he's trying to win an accommodation with Peking where his country would at least have a modicum of freedom if the Red Chinese and their North Vietnamese allies should win over. But Cambodia would be a pushover. The basic struggle would be in Thailand. That's what the Red Chinese want. They've already announced that they've set up a liberation committee for Thailand, and they've stepped up their subversion in the northeast, and the Thai government is doing its best to combat this subversion. by positive measures. Or, yeah. Question is, why do some of the people in the countryside support the Viet Cong? Is it because they have no choice, or is it because it's a lesser of two evils? This is a pretty difficult thing to measure. I'm amused by people like Norman Cousins who come out and they say the fact is that a majority of the people support the Viet Cong. I don't know where he gets his facts and figures. I think that Norman Cousins, by the very fact that he says it, it's supposed to be truth. It's a very difficult thing to evaluate. I stayed with a close friend in Saigon who was responsible for a hush-hush survey of the countryside without coercion, where they estimated that government support of the peasantry in the countryside varied between 60 and 70%. This was during the day, but these people had no axe to grind, and that the remainder probably were in sympathy to the Viet Cong. There are many who believe, and I am among them, that if the government could afford proper support to many of these villages, they would not necessarily be Viet Cong. But because these people never know who's going to be in their village that night or that day, they follow a precarious line so that they will bring offense to neither side, that they have to live. They're the ones who are caught in between. And I think somehow, some way, if the government could give many of these villagers greater security, the Viet Cong influence in the countryside would diminish. That many of those who join the Viet Cong forces don't do so willingly, but do so against their own will, because, again, the government cannot prevent this from happening. Yes? The question is, do the Montagnard, the hill people, speak Annamese or Vietnamese? Not too many of them, really. Some do and some don't. Many of them are so isolated from the Vietnamese that many of them don't even know the Vietnamese are around that area. There is such resentment among them that many of them refuse to speak Vietnamese or to learn it. At one point, I think probably more of them knew French than knew Vietnamese, because when the French were there, they treated the whole high plateau as one huge reservation. And the Montagnard generally liked the French. But this is a problem up there, communication. Some speak Vietnamese, but the problem has been that there have been so few schools up in this area that the only place you find schools up in the Montagnard area primarily is in the cities. And the Vietnamese live in the cities, so I think their literacy rate is about 1 or 2%, not much more, and as a result, very few of them speak Annamese or Vietnamese or Tonkinese or Cochinese or whatever you want to call them. Yes? Question is, do the Vietnamese resent the presence of American troops? Again, this is a difficult thing to evaluate. The communists have done their very best to stir up resentment towards the Americans, and all the evidence is that generally this has not succeeded for several reasons. One is, in the old days, the French, they had positions, they even were the policemen on the corner. They were ever present in the villages when they came around with their Vietnamese counterparts. They were the district chiefs and so forth and so on. They were right down into the lower level of administration. And the Vietnamese people can see that the Americans are advisors to the government, and they know quite well that usually our advice is not taken by the Vietnamese officials. And the realization is there in the countryside that we are not a colonial power, and as a result, I ran across very little resentment towards Americans. In some areas that are very pro-Viet Cong, you will find resentment towards us, but basically no. This part of the Viet Cong campaign has been a big flopperoo, but there is a danger of sending in too many forces which would give credence to the communist line that the Americans are at heart imperialists who intend to take over Vietnam once again. And this is one thing all Vietnamese are united on. They don't want any round eyes telling them what to do. All Vietnamese, virtually all, are glad to see the French gone, and they don't want them supplanted by another group of round eyes. Yes? The question is, how do the North Vietnamese feel about the government? What are conditions there? This is a pretty difficult thing to evaluate. Virtually no correspondents of any kind are let in there. I met a guy from TASS when I was in Laos, and also one from Radio Moscow with whom I talked at some length. And all indications are that the Vietnamese have their own problems. They did have a revolt by the peasantry from Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam, in his own home district several years back, where the peasants rebelled against the harshness of the government in forced collectivization. There have been sporadic revolts of a minor nature in North Vietnam against the government. There is also some evidence that the Vietnamese people in the North themselves are growing tired of the austere life that they must lead because of government support to South Vietnam and the units there, which of course cost them money. There have been fairly high defection rates on the part of the North Vietnamese who have come over and defected in South Vietnam, expressing dissatisfaction with conditions in their country. I don't think that one could ever expect a major revolt in North Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh has great prestige in the North and in some areas of the South, even among people who are anti-communist, because some regard him as the George Washington of Vietnam. The trouble will develop if and when Ho Chi Minh passes on, and this may be the only hope for winning the war in South Vietnam, incidentally. It's awfully difficult to evaluate exactly what the situation is up there. But the North Vietnamese and most communist power have an advantage that we don't have in governments that we're supporting or the South Vietnamese government is supporting, and that is a willingness to adopt any means to achieve an end. Terrorism, for example. This is why the guerrilla operation in the North, introduction of guerrilla operation in the North, has been such a failure, because the North Vietnamese don't hesitate to apply mass punishment to people if they support guerrillas who've come in from the outside. This is why the Viet Cong have assassinated better than 15,000 government officials in the last 5-6 years in order to strike terror into the hearts of the people, and they're willing to do so. I wish somehow, some way, that it would be possible for more correspondents to get into North Vietnam to evaluate conditions, but I don't think there's any possibility of mass revolt in Vietnam at this present time. Yes? Land reform is not a problem everywhere. It is in certain areas. The government instituted a land reform problem whereby the peasants had to pay for the land over a period of 10, 12 years. It's the traditional land reform that was applied in Japan and some areas, other areas of Asia. But the irony of it is, when the communists would come into an area such as this and hold it, albeit temporarily, they would say to the people, listen, as far as we're concerned, you don't have to pay for this land. You have it as of now. Don't worry about repaying the government. And if you want to keep it without continuing to pay for it, join us, and it's yours now with no further payments. And as a result, the land reform program, which was initiated by the government, is diminished in its value. And the feeling is on the part of many people that you have to apply instant land reform on the part of the government without demanding repayment if you're going to match the communists. There has been, and Henry Cabot Lodge turned this around in putting greater emphasis on economic and social reforms in the country and sending in school teachers and building wells and building access roads and trying to give them a better price for their rice. One of the problems has been the government is desperately looking for 200 U.S. aid personnel to go over to Vietnam in order to administer this program. That now we've got a program on the books which may fill this void which has existed, but now the problem is to find people who are willing to go over there and implement this program. It's there, but they can't implement it. They are finally on the right track, and the credit has to go to Ambassador Lodge, who was the one who turned around this and started it the other way. Yeah. Hmm. That's a marvelous idea. It's the one that I've advocated. Buy the country and give it back to the people. I think this is wise, and I think that it's a path that should be followed. Many of the Americans don't understand sometimes the intransigence of the Vietnamese, and one of the amusing things is the communists call the government American lackeys. You talk to any advisor which has to deal with the government, and he says, boy, I don't know who they're talking about. It certainly isn't us, because we talk until we're blue in the face, and these guys do just the opposite. They're so... I ran into a case up here in Tay Ninh where you have an excellent U.S. aid man up there who personally persuaded some of the people to come back into the government side, got land which was being unused by the government, resettled them, and pleaded with the government to allow him to give each one of them title to a couple of acres of land, and the government refused. And he's pretty embittered about this. He says, here we have a chance to turn these people to support the government because they've lived under communism, they don't like it. He says, they'd fight like tigers if I could only give them 2 lousy acres of land and a deed to it. One of the basic problems in Vietnam has been that many of the leaders of the government are also from the landowning class. This is true in Zim's day particularly, and true to a lesser degree today, and they've resisted really total land reform. And this is the case up in that area. But I think you're right. Let's buy it and give it to the people. We'd be better off in the long run. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Which is about the same amount that I heard last night. I think it's Pacific Telephone is spending here in Southern California for expansion. $1 million a day. Well, it's yeah. Well, this is one of the, you give rise to a story. The same guy I was telling you about up in Tay Ninh Province. I wrote a column about him for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I happen to be from Cleveland, and I did a series of articles for him on this area. His name's Ed Navarro, and Ed is a former colonel in the U.S. Army, a Filipino, who retired and went back over there. Well, this is exactly what he did. He had a little arrangement with the CIA, and he organized his own little guerrilla force, and he promised these guys so many dollars, I think it was $25 cash, for a Viet Cong dead or alive, and he also put in guarantees to make sure they didn't go out and chop up their friends and pass them off as a Viet Cong, and a weapon. And he was having more success with his own 200-man guerrilla force because he paid cash on the barrelhead than the Army was having in the area, because sometimes they get their pay and sometimes they wouldn't. He also instituted a program for communist defectors that if they came in with a weapon, he would give them $25. But he found out that he was financing Viet Cong R&R tours into Tay Ninh. The Viet Cong were giving one of their men an old rifle and say, well, go in and turn yourself into Navarro, and he'll give you $25 and spend about 2 weeks in there and have a good time, live it up, and then come on back and after you're well rested. So Ed has outdone them. He now demands a good weapon and not a homemade weapon if they come in. And this has been relatively successful. These programs have been applied in certain areas by certain individuals, and they've been highly successful. But it often depends on the man that you have in a province as to how successful it is. And Navarro is one of the very best ones. But he's done exactly what you talk about. They've tried to kill him twice. He's so effective up there. He even started a chicken farm. And his worst problem is not with the Viet Cong, ex-Viet Cong who are running it. He's the one who had that Chu Hoi Center, that open arms center, most successful in the country. His problem is with all the neighbors who steal the chickens from the Viet Cong, ex-Viet Cong. Yeah. Well, I was never a Zim lover. I was one of those that believed no news is good news. The general attitude that I found in the country was regret over the demise of President Zim, but no sadness over the departure of Brother New or Madam New. I asked people this question wherever I went, and Americans quite frequently forget that there was a coup d'etat against President Zim demanding that he fire his brother back in 1961. There was another one in early 1963. Same thing. Get rid of Brother New, who was thoroughly detested throughout the country. And most Vietnamese to whom I talked said, we are sad about what happened to President Zim, but he had to choose between his brother and his country. He chose his brother, so it's unfortunate he had to go. If there had only been some way that he could have been persuaded to get rid of his brother, he did have great prestige in Vietnam. But his brother so destroyed that prestige that most people were willing to see him go if that was the only way to get rid of the brother. I was telling Don and Joel before, he had the American Mag headquarters up at Quin Yan, big hotel. He owned it. And his price was $4,000 a month in green, payable the first of every month. And he had little deals like this throughout the country, and the people knew about it, and they were pretty unhappy with him. Nobody's sorry to see him going. They are sorry to see Zim gone. Yeah. Question is whether the bombings will have any effect on forcing the North Vietnamese to negotiate. As long as you have a privileged sanctuary, as you have had in North Vietnam, it's a war that probably could not be won. You're fighting by a double standard. They can retreat to inviolate territory and you can't touch them. The war probably could not be won unless some of these staging areas were attacked. But even so, this is generally, as you indicated, is symbolic. The actual damage is relatively little. But it does show that our determination to stay, there is a belief in Hanoi and in Red China that we are paper tigers. They have said this so often, they believe it, and that eventually we will pull out. And this fear has spread to the South Vietnamese in some instances, and some of them were temporizing. By striking north, it was in essence saying, listen, we're willing to risk a big war, but we're going to stay here. And if you want to talk, you better start talking. We are willing to negotiate, no matter what Washington says or doesn't say. But if the sole thing which you're going to negotiate is the withdrawal of American forces, that's all the North Vietnamese have said. They don't want to talk unless this is the major objective of the talks. Withdrawal of Americans. Not withdrawal of North Vietnamese from the South, but withdrawal of Americans. There are other areas that are negotiable. I think there's an area of compromise that could be worked out. But I don't think that the North Vietnamese or the Red Chinese are convinced as yet that we really intend to stay there over the long pull. They believe that Americans demand instant achievement, instant success, that eventually American public opinion or our own lack of significant success will cause us to pull out. But the area that I think is negotiable and eventually may be negotiable is trade between North and South. This is something that President Zim was adamant about with backing from John Foster Dulles. There has never been cultural or economic exchange between these two halves. And there are some who believe that this infiltration started because of the North Vietnamese frustration in their inability to break through to establish trade relations. Someday, I think this will be a point worth negotiating, and that this may eventually be the reason that the two sides will sit down at a conference table and achieve a compromise. I don't think it'll come tomorrow. It won't come until the North Vietnamese are convinced that the me's, the Americans, aren't going to go home very soon. They aren't doing much damage over there. Shoot, like to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail, you got a corridor, 50 miles wide, 800 miles long, covered with jungle, you can't even see the ground. Who's kidding whom? What are you bombing? I don't think so. I hope not. I hope not. I think it'll be continual pressure of this nature, and another pressure which hasn't been announced, and that is the sealing off of the Ho Chi Minh corridor. Actually putting troops into the jungles of Laos and cutting off the supply trail. And nobody has said whether this is being done, but I still wonder what happened to the 5,000 South Koreans who have arrived in South Vietnam, where they are today. They say they're engineers. Ho, ho, ho. That's rich. I think they may be up trying to interdict the Ho Chi Minh corridor. And again, this will be further evidence of Western resolution or South Vietnamese resolution not to pull out. And that has to be done. I think that to bomb Hanoi, to bomb Haiphong up in that area, almost forces the Vietnamese to go into all-out war. It's a fine line that's being walked at the present time, and one slip and it could be war. Up to this point it has been symbolic, and if it goes any further than that, we're in deep trouble, boy. It's calculated risk. Calculated. Yes? Question is, how about free elections in Vietnam? They had them in 1956. Those were the last ones where they voted out Emperor Bao Dai and changed the country from an imperial regime into a republic. That was a pretty fair election. They haven't had one since. Every coup d'etat that comes in, they claim that they're going to hold free elections. And the last talk was they were going to hold them this fall. If they held them at this time, I think it'd be moot as to which way it would go, whether it would go for the government or for the Viet Cong, if they could get into all areas. I don't know what would happen, really. And I think at this time the instability domestically is such, I'm not sure that this is the moment to hold them until they do achieve greater stability internally, until we have a government for at least a month or two, so that they know where they're going and what they are doing, so that people know who in the world they're voting for. Now it's a pig in a poke. Yeah. Much of the country that they have captured has been relatively sparsely populated area. For example, the high plateau and down the extreme south. And many of the areas that they hold only if the government does not come in and try and get it. The basic problem, again, of the government in having to defend everything and the Viet Cong nothing. That usually their control is somewhat tenuous until the government makes a concerted effort to pull them out. You could probably accomplish that, the same type of thing in similar terrain down in Louisiana, which is the same type of country, with a relatively small army of dissidents down there if the pro-segregationists down there ever decided they wanted to tackle the state, they wouldn't have too much difficulty in their ability to melt with the people and so forth and so on. This is one of the essentials of a national war of liberation, how to uncover those within the midst who are communist sympathizers. And quite frankly, until we learn how to control this thing, we've got problems, because we're going to find this type of thing thrown at us in many, many areas. The communists have two advantages, as I indicated before: their use of selective terror, and also the fact that they don't have to defend anything. They can strike at a place and time of their own choosing. And boy, I'll tell you, everybody over there is frustrated that this ragtag army is able to be so effective. It is said that the ratio that you need to wage a successful guerrilla war is about 15 to 1, and they have never achieved this ratio in order to give security to all of the areas of high priority, in order to contain it, to destroy it. Yes? Question is, has the propaganda activity by the USIS been effective? I would say generally no. It's been effective in convincing the people that we are not a colonial power and we don't want Vietnam. It's the last thing in the world we want. In fact, sometimes I think it served the communists right to take it over. Let them have the headaches. But it's these other countries. USIS propaganda has generally been ineffective because of the lethargy of the Vietnamese themselves. In many instances, they're trying to defend a status quo which sometimes isn't very defensible. And quite frankly, I don't think it's been as effective as it should be or could be. They've done a lot of going out with Vietnamese army teams into the countryside with movies, propaganda movies, dropping leaflets, going in, conducting Psy-war projects to explain the intentions of the government, what it hopes to do for them and not do to them. Mainly the promises of the government for the raising of the standard of the living of the people in the countryside. It's a program in which USIA has worked very closely with the Vietnamese people, and most of it has been with movies and with stage shows going out into the villages, and then with a propaganda pitch tied into it, urging them to support the government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But not too effective, really. Communists have a built-in advantage when you're trying to oust the ends. It's like a political campaign here. You can go down past their past record and just say, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, without specifically coming up with a program of yours. It's always an advantage of the outs over the ins. And they have this built-in advantage. Plus, they've got a lot of pretty bad things. There are some things about the government that aren't too attractive that they can make telling points with. Yes? I think the question is, what real power do the Buddhists have? I think that we oftentimes make a mistake over here in confusing with those who are articulate with those who are popular. And I think this is the case of the Buddhists. They're far more articulate than they are popular among the people. They have been able to muster a few groups of diehards and extremists to support their crowd. I think sometimes on college campuses you can see how a vocal minority can pretend to represent itself as embodying majority opinion. It always isn't true. I think this has been true of the Buddhists of late in Saigon, because most of the things that they have demanded have been granted to them. And we haven't heard from them from a while. I don't know why. We probably will. I think a lot of them, too, were bolstered by the fact that they had relatively good success in the Zim regime and sort of feeling their power. But I don't think that some of the extreme Buddhists are representative of the mass thinking of many of the Buddhists. Zaloi Pagoda, which is probably the #1 pagoda, the leadership of it has disavowed Tri Quang and some of the other hotheads, if you want to use that term, on those who are calling for everybody to get out. And the leadership itself is just split into one area. One calls for Americans to get out, and the other one has called for Americans and North Vietnamese to get out. Yes? Well, this is extremely important. Most of the landowners, many of the landowners are now dead, like members of the Zim family and his brother and sister-in-law and so forth and so on, who were most influential and large landholders. One of the, again, a basic problem within your Vietnamese government has been the fact that it is urban-oriented, and has been for a long time, because only those who lived in the cities had access to education under the French. And as a result, by default, they are the leaders today. And many of them have no identification with the countryside. And many of them came from landowning families. It's a problem that we've been working on over there, and which has not bolstered the image of the government in Saigon, because there are many peasants who feel that it represents the interests of the urban areas and not the interests of the rural areas. Again, when you get into this thing, it's such a keg of worms. There are so many of these diverse attitudes, your different religions, landowners, city owners, whether somebody is from Annam, which is in central Vietnam, or Tonkin, which is in the north, or whether they're from Cochin. Every time you turn around, there's a new issue to bedevil this whole situation. Then you got the Montagnards on top of all this, and then you got some Cambodians down in the south who don't like the government, don't like the Viet Cong, and different religious sects. Without a doubt, this is one of the thorniest problems that we have, is assisting the Vietnamese in establishing an identity for themselves as Vietnamese first, and not their village first, or their religious sect first, or their national origin first. And this has been one of the problems that we have had in advising these people along this line. You know, you raised a question about going to war or somebody. I've run across in some of these talks people who say, let's go get the Chinese. Let's get it over with. You know, that scares me when somebody says that. Not only that it would be a massive war, of course, is terrifying, but what would happen if we won? That's what really frightens me. What would we do with them if we won? That'd be a dandy problem. Maybe one more before I see it's getting that time. Answer, if not. Again, thanks very much for your attention, for your interest. I appreciate it very much. Thank you and good afternoon.